might actually be getting a little rain up in Sacramento today, so.
I'm not happy to be somewhere where it's not raining. So just as kind of a reminder, a refresher of where we started out with, in our first one of this lecture series, we talked about kind of water and climate 101 in California, the setting for the climate and hydrology and water infrastructure of our state. In our second lecture last week, we talked about the drought aspect of this. This week, we're going to talk about floods, because the reality is that when you look at water management, you're not managing for average conditions, you manage for the extremes, either the wet or the dry. So those are the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about. And in our lecture next week, we'll be talking more about the climate change adaptation aspects of things. And I might just touch on something Jerry just referred to, which is today the governor's office put out a press release, kind of the opening announcement for an initiative that our governor is going to be taking on climate change and extreme events. Extreme events being floods, wildfire, heat waves, et cetera, et cetera. And those of us in state agencies who deal with extreme events are going to be doing a series of complementary events to the governor's announcement that will focus on our particular area of interest, in our case, floods. And we expect to be down here in Southern California a couple times in January or February on that subject. So is your PR thing doing, or your AV thing doing okay there? Oh, it's outside?
It's birth.
Okay, I wondered what that was. So with that as background, let's go ahead and start talking about floods in California. And so I'll start off by talking about sort of the background on floods, how we manage them, what they mean, those kinds of things. And then Mark will follow and talk about the meteorology associated with them, how we forecast, how we observe, what we do with the information, with respect to what we think we have coming in our direction in terms of floods. So this is actually what I'll be covering, and it's kind of a challenge to do this in one lecture, because this is actually a really large topic. So we'll try to see it more out of your way here. This is really a pretty large topic, so I'm going to be jumping around a little bit to get through all of this tonight. So it's kind of obligatory when you talk about floods in California, you always have to start with the fact that Governor Leland Stanford went to his inauguration in a rowboat because of the flood. And remember, in our first lecture series, we talked about how highly variable California's climate was, and in fact we had a major flood and a major drought in consecutive years in the 1860s, and that really set the stage for pointing out to people that, you know, California does have some significant water challenges. The Great Flood of the winter of 1861-62 was a very large flood, was statewide in nature. Unfortunately, because they didn't have a lot of recording instrumentation at the time, we can't really quantify it as well as we would like to. But for me, it definitely has a particular significance, because the story goes that Governor Stanford rode from the second floor of his mansion and took the rowboat, over to the Capitol area for the inauguration. His mansion is right next to my office building. So I can look out the window and see how high the second story of the mansion is. And just imagining Sacramento covered in that much water. Sacramento, of course, is at the confluence of the American and the Sacramento rivers. And in fact, as a consequence of this particular flood, that is downtown Sacramento in the picture there. K Street, which was the principal street that went away from the river, as part of the how do we deal with the flooding after the fact, one of the things the merchants along K Street did was raise a number of city blocks. Literally, they brought in 12 to 14 feet worth of fill and essentially raised the entire street. And so what were at one time the first floors of buildings became the basements and so on. And in fact, you can do a tour in old Sacramento called Underground Sacramento, which is what used to be the first floor. So very familiar with the effects of this flood in Northern California, but it was also experienced down here. And in fact, there are historical accounts for Los Angeles County that talk about basically everything between the San Gabriel Mountains and the coast as being just essentially a large lake. So very wet throughout the state, and as we also talked about, it was kind of the first stage in the demise of the great cattle ranches that then occupied Southern California. So we need to talk a little bit about different kinds of floods. In California, we're dominated by winter storm events, and while there may be some summer thunderstorm activity and with some monsoonal remnants over in the extreme southeastern part of our desert area in the state, it's largely a winter flood season. And like when we talked last week about droughts being local phenomena, when you think of floods, the impacts are really something you think about at the local level. Just as with droughts, you can have two areas side by side that experience very different impacts from a particular storm event, because one area may have a relatively well-managed or well-controlled flood system, while another doesn't have the infrastructure or has bad levees, resulting in significant damages. So when we think about impacts of floods, it's important to keep in mind that you do have to associate them with a geographical area. But unlike droughts, we are not faced with the problem of knowing when there is a flood. You know, we talked last week about the fact that there's some different ways to look at what defines a drought, because droughts are slow-moving and take a long time to happen, relatively speaking. Floods, you tend to know right away, and it's where the water is where you don't want it to be. And different types of storm events cause floods of different kinds, and drainage area is very much an important factor. Bigger the river basin, the more likely you are to have large impacts because you're working with a large volume of water. If you look at the smallest scale, it's what we usually call local flooding or stormwater flooding. And that would be such as what Long Beach has experienced in a couple of recent winter seasons, when you had a lot of stormwater flooding down in the lower part of the downtown area here that was basically simply it rained too intensely, too soon, too quickly, and that overtaxed the capability of the stormwater system to handle it. That would be an example of local stream flooding. And then we can go all the way up to your major large-scale floods in the Central Valley, very large drainage basins. And then something that you have a lot of in Southern California are alluvial fan sorts of flooding and debris flows. And we'll be talking a little bit more about those later on. Just as a reminder, I showed this slide at the earlier session, but these are California's largest rivers. And as we said earlier, we do have one Southern California river in the list with respect to watershed area, the Amargosa, but there's no water in it. Largest river that actually has water in it in Southern California is the Santa Ana River. Everything down here is really small in comparison to the big river basins in terms of runoff. So that's why when we talked about drought, we spent a lot of time talking about Southern California because it's a water short area, half the population lives here. Well, when you talk about floods, we spend more time talking about Northern California because that's where the water is and where the large amounts of water are up where you have the flood problems. So if we look at just the geography of the state for a minute from the standpoint of our flood geography, so here in the Central Valley, I forget the pointer, it doesn't really, fades out too much, but they're in the Central Valley. This is basically like a big bathtub in the flood season, so to speak, because you can have an awful lot of water coming in from the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Mountain Range and having to make its way through this valley and get out through the San Francisco Bay, Golden Gate to the ocean. So we're dealing with very large volumes of water here, and when you're dealing with very large volumes of water, the way you manage them from a flood control standpoint in these big basins is that you try to use upstream dams with large reservoirs to contain the flood waters and then release them over time into the river channels and let the water flow out. And here a flood event can take days, if not close to a week, to kind of move through the system. So they're somewhat slower moving. Here in Southern California, you tend to have a lot of flash flood type activities. You have small drainage basins, such as those in the headwaters of some of the mountain ranges down here, like the San Gabriels or the San Bernardinos, relatively small drainage basins on the upper part of the watershed. There are some small debris basins to catch some of the major mud flow type of material that might be coming off of that, but not a lot of water storage capacity because you don't normally have a lot of water to work with. So in Southern California, we have the situation of it hits really fast, small storage, small upper watershed, no storage. So you focus on the channelization and controlling the floodwaters, through the channels down here, such as the Los Angeles River. And these tend to concentrate the flood flows very quickly, and the water moves through the system quickly. So it's kind of a different response period with respect to, say, the Central Valley. So let's talk about the early years of the Central Valley. In the first lecture, I had mentioned how much of our water management infrastructure dates back to the gold rush days. Well, there's a very important aspect of this with respect to the flood control world. After the 49ers first came to California, they soon realized that, miners working along with a pick and shovel in the stream bed, that was not how they got the easy pickings in a few years, and they soon moved on to more elaborate techniques to try to find the gold, including hydraulic mining, which was a great way to move a lot of stream channels materials quickly and get out the gold, but hugely damaging with respect to moving all that sediment downstream and into the rivers. And this very quickly erupted into a major legal conflict between the downstream farmers who were experiencing flooding as a result of this hydraulic mining, and the hydraulic miners who wanted to keep on doing this. And in fact, in places that used to be navigable for steamships, because gold rush first started, the way you got to the gold fields often was you got on a steamship, bigger steamship in San Francisco, came up the river to Sacramento, and then maybe transferred to a smaller boat and went upstream, even as far up as, say, almost Red Bluff area, well up at the north end of the Sacramento Valley. Well, when this started happening, first thing that went was navigation. And the beds of some of the streams were raised by maybe 10, 12 feet. And of course, when you no longer had the channel capacity, every time you had a rainstorm, it flooded, and a lot of the farmers' lands would be damaged. So this resulted in some very protracted litigation and legislative attempts in the California legislature. And ultimately, in 1884, the court banned these miners from doing this anymore. Basically, the farmers won. But one of the consequences then of that was that we had all of these streams in the Sacramento River basin, which is the wettest part of our area, that the channel capacity had been hugely reduced because it was filled with mud. So the question is, well, what do you do about it? And there was a long debate among the flood control folks at the time of how to manage it. They knew they had to construct flood control works to deal with it. The question was, should you build levees right up next to the riverbed with the idea you want to have a really narrow channel and flush all that sediment downstream, or should you try and build these really wide channels, as some people were familiar with from eastern settings, and let the river kind of meander, but you might not sluice as much stuff downstream? Well, unfortunately for us today, the narrow approach won. We say unfortunately because eventually at the time it did work. A lot of that material did get sluiced downstream, where it got dumped in San Francisco Bay, so they have a slight problem down there. But at least it got out of the upper river system, which was what they wanted. But today that greatly impedes our ability to do things now with respect to managing floods, because we only have this very narrow footprint to work in. We don't have a more natural setting where you have a lot of room for the river to meander and you can have riparian habitat and all those things we would like to have today. So this is an unfortunate legacy of the gold rush that has greatly affected our ability to do things in the Sacramento Valley. But other early things that happened, Congress in 1893, so not quite 10 years after hydraulic mining was banned, recognized how bad the situation was in the Sacramento Valley because of all of this residue from the hydraulic mining, and they created an entity called the California Debrief Commission, which lasted for almost 100 years as a federal agency, to figure out how to deal with this mess that had been created and to manage the system. And then in 1917, Congress authorized the Sacramento flood control system, one of the first three what we call modern flood control projects authorized in the United States, and also the only one in California at the time. Quite a significant recognition of how bad the flooding situation was in the Sacramento Valley. Yeah, Brett?
Are these the levees they talk about post-Katrina failing and being unstable?
These are all levees that are much older than Katrina.
Older?
Yeah, I mean, much of this levee system, the initial beginnings of levees in the Central Valley, let me do this here. So if we look at the Central Valley, after the gold miners arrived, 1850, let's say, and started working, the farmers moved in right behind them because they saw that there was more money to be made farming, perhaps, than mining for gold. But the Central Valley, if you read early historical accounts of California, people were not too fond of it. You see words like malaria-infested swamp mentioned frequently. You see things like inhospitable, let's see, there's one famous one that was something like inhospitable bog or something like that. And in fact, when William Brewster and the first Geological Survey were making their way through California to document the conditions that existed there, they did not have good things to say about. They were crossing the San Joaquin Valley at the time, but much of the year, if it was a wet year, it was very impassable along the middle of the valley, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers. And in fact, good point, but let's see this with a laser, but in the San Joaquin Valley here, so here's the San Joaquin Valley roughly. The San Joaquin River comes out of the mountains here, flows north, goes out to the bay. The south half of this area is actually what we call the Tulare Lake Basin, and normally it's a closed basin, which means that drainage from this part of the Sierra in here would not flow out of this basin except in very, very wet years. And in very, very wet years, there are historical accounts of people basically taking a boat all the way from down here in Bakersfield all the way up to the Delta. And in fact, someone recreated that in a kayak in 1983, which was a very wet year. But so it was very, very wet there. And because that was the winter conditions, if you wanted to farm, you had to create some levees of your own. And a lot of farmers started out building private levees that later on may have gotten incorporated into some of the subsequent levee systems that ultimately became part of a flood control project. We're talking mules and scrapers. And in parts of the Sac Valley, you have Chinese laborers. When they finished building the railroad, they started working on levees. Not designed to modern engineering standards by any means. So let's see. Oops, sorry, got ahead of myself there. So anyway, so Congress authorizes the flood control system. Oops. So Congress authorizes the flood control system in 1917, and that kind of marks the beginning of a time period in which we start seeing lots of flood control projects getting built in California. And so fast forward to today, the Sacramento River Flood Control Project, which is an Army Corps of Engineers project with the state of California as the local sponsor, and some parts of the levees are owned by local agencies. Largest flood control project in the state, 1,600 miles of levees, numerous other control structures such as weirs, and one of the few flood control projects in the U.S. that actually incorporates a major bypass. At the time, back around 1910s, 1920s, when they were figuring out how to deal with this mess that was what was left after the hydraulic mining happened in the Sacramento Valley, they realized that the channel capacity of the Sacramento was so limited, and the volumes of flood flow potentially so large, that what they needed to do was actually build a bypass that would sort of run more or less parallel to the river and bypass Sacramento. Take all that water out of the system and then put it back in the channel downstream of Sacramento. That was a really insightful thing that they did, and frankly one of the things is probably saved Sacramento in terms of flooding on the Sacramento River itself. That was a major piece of engineering. Of course, there are many other Corps of Engineer flood control projects throughout the valley. And just to point out that when we talk about the crumbling levees in the delta, we additionally have 1,100 miles of levees, most of which are not in great shape in the delta. So we definitely live in a world of levees in the Central Valley. And as I mentioned at the earlier session, California's first state engineer, William Ham Hall, the famous quote, "Two kinds of levees, those that have failed, those that are going to." Of course, when he was writing, or when he was saying that, circa 1900, he was very familiar with these basically farmer-built levees, very poor technology, and those were the kind of levees that definitely did fail frequently. So he was rightfully so very skeptical of the ability of a levee-only system to provide flood protection. So if we compare that now to Southern California and think about Southern California, so in the Central Valley we're dealing with very large amounts of water that we have to deal with and get it through the system and out into the delta, move it a long distance relatively speaking. Here in Southern California, Los Angeles River is 90 miles long, something like that. Very small upper watershed, steep mountains right adjacent to the ocean, great setting for high intensity floods. And in fact, California's record for precipitation intensity, inches of rainfall per hour, is set in the San Gabriel Mountains. And if you remember a slide that Kelly Redmond showed from the first meeting where he showed a number of high intensity events in California, they were all right down in this area around the San Gabriels, because like with real estate, location is everything. This just happens to be a perfect setting to capture those high intensity events. You don't have a lot of watershed to work with, and therefore you have a flash flood type scenario, which can often also lead to debris flows. Now, how many people here know what an alluvial fan is? Okay, good. Okay, so that's a picture of one there. That's actually the Santa Rosa Mountains. And one of the issues here in Southern California is development on alluvial fans. Now, when you think about how California developed historically, well, any place in the country, the earliest settlers, of course, settled right next to the river. That was where the land was flat. You needed the rivers for transportation. This was before there were highways and railroads. So you wanted to be close to your transportation source. You wanted to be close to your water source. The best lands were farming, typically in those nice valley bottom areas. And really, people continued doing that up until well into or thinking that was the norm, well into the 20th century. But now we, hope that we know a little better about this, and we're trying to do things like, through zoning and through floodplain management, encourage people to not develop in the floodplain, or not develop at least in the highest risk portions of the floodplain. And one of the things that was apparent in Southern California, particularly in the Inland Empire, when the real estate boom was really booming, was if you went out the I-10 corridor, towards Ontario, you saw all this development on the alluvial fans of the San Bernardino Mountains in areas that you could clearly look at and say, these are at risk for this kind of flooding. And the kind of flooding that you would experience in an alluvial fan, you don't have a defined channel at first for the water. It just flows off a sheet flow across from the apex to the top of the fan, flows downhill, and eventually starts concentrating in little channels, and pretty soon you have some little arroyos or creeks. And if the area is undeveloped or the soil is disturbed, say because of a burned area from a wildfire, that's a great setting for debris flows. And a lot of the flood damage in Southern California in the mountain areas is often actually related to a debris flow type of setting, not just the water being the issue. And then at the smallest end of the size range, we have local or stormwater flooding. And sometimes people think of this as nuisance level flooding. It's typically when you design a flood control project to protect, like say, a city or something of that nature. About 20 years ago or so, the federal government made a policy statement that they believed that a 200-year flood was sort of the standard project design approach that should be used for protecting urban areas. We'll talk a little bit about, in a minute, about the FEMA flood insurance program, which uses a 100-year level of protection as a minimum. Well, in terms of stormwater design, if you're a developer and you're going to build a new subdivision, you go to your county or city that has the land use authority, and they hand you something called the County Improvement Standards, the County Hydraulic Manual. They go by different names, but essentially it's design criteria that you will use to build all of the infrastructure, the roads, the streets, the stormwater for your subdivision. And typically the design criteria for different pieces of a municipal stormwater system, some of the biggest features might have a call for design based on a 50-year storm. A lot of it is down to 5- and 10-year level for some of the smaller features. Because it's a trade-off between cost and level of protection. It's not the same thing as needing to protect an entire city from the effects of a 100-year flood. If you have a flood that causes a little bit of street flooding, maybe it's not such a huge issue, so you accept that as a trade-off for a less costly design standard. And some cities in the Southern California area were recently challenged, almost 2 years ago now, when there were a couple of high-intensity storms down here. And that actually is a photo from downtown Long Beach area. So this would be basically a stormwater system overflow kind of flood. Of course, the owner of that truck would not consider that to be a nuisance flood event, and that's probably pushing it from the city's viewpoint as well. But this is the kind of thing that you see in a local flood. So what about the institutional framework for how we manage floods and what agencies are involved? Early on, the Army Corps of Engineers became the sort of federal flood control leader, actually back in the 1800s. And that model has continued through today, and really much of the flood control infrastructure in the country is designed and built by the Corps of Engineers with a local or sometimes a state agency as a cost-sharing partner. The terminology is actually called them the local sponsor. And normally the way it works these days is that the local sponsor goes to their congressional district and asks their member or representative in the Congress to support a flood control project for their area. And these projects get authorized individually by Congress. The federal government historically paid a very large share of the cost of building it, which was great for the local entities, and the local entities would take ownership of the facilities and, of course, provide the O&M. But the very first of what we call the modern flood control acts that Congress enacted was this one I mentioned in 1917. It covered 3 projects. Look who the other 2 are. The Ohio River and the Mississippi. Those are really big river systems, really wet. And the fact that the Sacramento made it into that list at a time when the state's population was less than 2 million people really shows how much of a flood risk or flood problem that was perceived as being. So from that first modern Flood Control Project Act through really almost the end of the 1960s, the federal flood policy continued in this direction of we will build bigger and better levees, in the infrastructure aspect. But as we got into the 1960s, people were starting to think about, well, maybe we should try and come at it from the other way and talk about floodplain management. Instead of letting people build right in the middle of the river channel, hey, it's dry most of the time, that should be okay. Maybe we should, try and not build there because it would be so much cheaper to the taxpayers of the United States and they didn't have to keep building these flood control projects in locations where people really shouldn't have settled in the first place. And that was when you started seeing this idea of a flood insurance program and guidelines to encourage communities not to build in the worst of the floodplains. So, and in the National Flood Insurance Act, a 100-year standard of protection was first officially endorsed or blessed by the federal government. And then you come to 1973 and you have something that really has teeth in it at this point, because that says if you want to get a mortgage from a federally guaranteed program, you have to buy flood insurance. And the idea was that this is going to better manage the risk associated with flooding, so it's not 100% based on the idea of the federal government protecting you with infrastructure. And the way that I mentioned all of these local flood control projects are funded is through what are called omnibus authorization acts, and they all have the title these days of a Water Resources Development Act. And Congress passes a new one every 4, 5, 6 years, something like that, and authorizes a number of local flood control projects. If you look at the Santa Ana River down here in Southern California, for example, they've had some of the larger ones in Southern California in the last couple of decades. Seven Oaks Dam, for example, San Bernardino vicinity, that was an example of a project constructed, authorized in a Water Resources Development Act, constructed by the Corps with a local agency sponsor. Now, in theory, the way the system is supposed to work today, and it would have been nice if it had started that way originally, this is the concept of managing floods. In the old days, people used to talk about flood control, this idea that we could just build levees and that would take care of everything. Then the more modern thinking emerged of, well, you know, really what we're trying to do is manage the risk. And that entails managing the flood plain, not just building more levees. So the idea is you start out with an initial level of risk, and the first thing you do is zoning. If you're in an area where new development is occurring, don't let people build in the highest, riskiest areas of the floodplain. And if they do build, or you do allow them to build there, put some teeth in building codes regarding what they can do in a floodplain. And in fact, something that you'll see now if you drive I-5 north towards Sacramento, drive through the end of the San Joaquin River area around Stockton, and you will see homes that have been permitted to build in an area that will flood in places like the McCullamy River or the Calaveras River, but the home is built like on stilts, or it's actually built on a very large berm. So you'll be driving by and here's a 10-acre parcel with a home on it that's basically sitting on a 15-foot high berm. They look kind of odd, but that was, that's an example of controlling through a building code sort of restriction and requiring some basic flood-proofing construction techniques with respect to the foundation and things like that. Now the next stage on here is what they call outreach here, which is basically educating local communities and entities that control land use planning and zoning about how to manage risk. Next step is where actually our friends from the National Weather Service specialize: forecasts, warnings, and ultimately evacuations. If in a Katrina type situation, for example, you know the hurricane is coming, so you start putting out watches and warnings, and then you start talking to your local emergency managers, and if it looks like there's going to be a really big problem, then you evacuate the people if you think that there's going to be a serious event happening. And then finally, we get down to the area of seawalls, levees, and infrastructure. So this is not your first line of defense, it's considerably farther down on the list. And then the red area that's shown on this graph is the risk that's left over. Well, unfortunately, the legacy that we have throughout the U.S. is not just a California problem, but people used to come about it the other way. So they take this graph and turn it on its head, and you start out with the infrastructure and kind of go downhill from there. So what about some of the major floods that we've experienced in California? The first one is the one I mentioned, our Great Flood of 1861 to 62. A couple of floods in the 1950s that particularly stood out because they were wake-up calls. We went through the first half of the 1900s without anything hugely exciting in terms of floods, and then bang, we got two big ones in very close order in the early 1950s. December 1964, I'll talk about in a minute. January 1969 was an event that actually hit more of the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California than it did Northern California, worse down in this part of the world. February 86, another big one. January 1997, that was our last major, really large-scale flood event in California. And some folks think that the volume of flooding experienced more or less statewide in that event was probably analogous to 1861, 1862. We don't know for sure because the records, of course, the measurements did not exist at that time. Interesting to point out, too, that there's one year that you don't see on this chart, and that's 1983. 1983 was actually the wettest single year we had in California in terms of runoff. However, the timing of the runoff was such that we had some flooding, but nothing at the scale of these events. So it goes to show it isn't necessarily all about the quantity of water you get. It's also about how fast it comes, and if you have time for the water to move through the system and get handled that way. Oh, and notice some of those dates have asterisks after them. One of our challenges when we think about climate change and flooding is that we'd like to better be able to predict in advance when a flood is going to happen, or that a big storm is going to happen that would create a flood. And as Mark will probably tell you, the outlook that's available in terms of meteorological forecasting is maybe about 10 days max. They attempt to do climate outlooks, seasonal outlooks that would go beyond that, but that's a realm of more the research climate science and not useful for operational purposes. Well, I believe that I have discovered a new forecasting tool here that gives us a great predictability. All of those events with asterisks were Christmas floods. The one with 2 asterisks was New Year's, so that was an outlier. But there is something to be said about, thinking about that latter part of December, early part of January as being a very wet time of year in California, because we've had some of our biggest flood events literally right at Christmas. So let's talk about the Christmas 1964 flood. And I was going to play you a nice little video clip of it, but unfortunately technology created some problems here, so we will pass on that. But this would be the video that is upstairs in our exhibit on water and climate change. So you'll have to go see the exhibit and play the video. It's only about a 90-second clip. The Christmas 1964 flood was the flood of record for the North Coast. It actually hit Oregon and Washington as well. Very severe flood there. It was an atmospheric river event. And you remember that Kelly Redmond talked to you about atmospheric rivers at our first session. And arguably, I would say it's probably the most severe coastally oriented flood that we've had in California. Now, California's north coast, I pointed out that the Klamath River Basin is the second wettest in California. Very wet, fortunately not a lot of population in terms of this kind of event. But also, if you've ever been up in that part of the world, you know we have a lot of very rugged mountain ranges. There's very steep river canyons through there, and there are no flat places to build except in the bottom of those river canyons until you get right out to the coastal area. Well, what happened was we had a very intense atmospheric river storm come through. It stayed there a while. It rained a heck of a lot, and essentially the entire north coast was really I'm trying not to say wiped out, but that's probably a good way to put it, because what happened is all of those coastal rivers experienced tremendous flow volumes, and it literally wiped out a number of those small communities. I mean, it completely demolished those small towns that were built in the bottom of some of those river canyons, and most of those were not subsequently rebuilt. But also because of the huge amount of debris that the rivers were carrying, they took out almost all the highway bridges in the entire area, and the entire North Coast region was completely isolated. And what we show in the little video is that as part of the relief effort for that flood, they actually took an aircraft carrier out of Long Beach, drove it up the coast, and parked it off the coast to serve as a staging area for airplanes who spent weeks hauling in food and medicine to all of those communities.
When you say North Coast, what area? Are you talking about up to Washington or
California? Eureka, Arcata, the Klamath River, the Eel River, up in
everything north of San Francisco.
Yeah, north of the Russian River, let's say. And about 30 lives were lost in this flood. And so this was 1964, and that kind of loss of life in what we would consider a modern flood era, really unacceptable. Part of the problem was that this was before some of the meteorological technology existed that we have today. Didn't have that. The ability to do forecasts and watches and warnings was limited here. Many of these North Coast rivers are wild and scenic, or there are, for other reasons, no dams built on them. So unlike the Sierras, where we have some ability to, store some water, knock off peaks, manage the flow down through the system, there's very little ability to control the flows up there. So it's largely what we call an unregulated system. People didn't really have any warning that a really major storm was coming, and tremendous amount of economic damage. Another thing that when we look at it from a standpoint of thinking about scenario planning for coastal flooding was that for some meteorological reasons and wind conditions, sea levels were greatly elevated at that time. So you have a whole lot of water coming down towards the ocean, wants to exit the ocean, sea level's a lot higher, and you start getting a backwater effect that hit all of those communities that were right on the coast.
Do they know why the sea level in that particular area was because of an event?
Basically, it was a combination of right time of year in terms of tides, it was winds, it was barometric pressure, those kinds of meteorological things. It actually was not an El Nino year. Some of the highest problems with coastal flooding were experienced in a couple of the big La Nina years, El Nino years like 1983, for example, but this was not one. It was just another combination of circumstances. But if we were to say, well, let's imagine what a coastal flood might look like in 2100 when we expect sea level to be 5 feet higher, this is kind of a good analog for some of the the problems that you would have with moving water through the lower part of your system, particularly if you go from an area that has a relatively steep gradient and all of a sudden it levels out like right at the coast where Eureka is, for example, or Long Beach for that matter, since this is very flat right here. So, and something, Kelly also used a version of this slide in his talk. This is a slide that we turn to frequently when we talk about flooding in California. This happens to be flood flows in the American River at Fair Oaks, which is basically Sacramento. And I remember that I mentioned that 1950-55 floods were kind of a wake-up call because we really hadn't seen anything big like that in the record. Look at the first half of the last century compared to the second half. First half, an occasional wet period, nothing really major. And then look what happened after that. And in fact, for those of you who can't read it in the back, in the corner it says, prior to 1950, there were no flood events with a three-day flow of greater than 1,000 CFS. And after 1950, there were 5 events greater than that level. Now, okay, so obviously something happened. Well, maybe it's purely random, statistically random events. We only have 100, lower 100 years of record. Possible. It seems kind of heavy concentration of those big events. Might be some kind of shift in natural variability that we don't understand or haven't been able to figure out, or maybe it's climate change, or some combination of all three. We don't know. We'd really love to know. But Folsom Dam was built completed just before that flood in 1950. And had the dam not been there, Sacramento probably would have been severely damaged. Because that storm was actually the design storm for which was then the 500-year event that Folsom Dam was designed on the basis of. The one that you're not supposed to experience. So we've had multiple versions of that extreme design storm since then. So, and this is not just a phenomenon in the American River, it's the northern, all the Sac River Basin. So this gives us great pause when we think about future flooding with climate change. So here are some of the challenges that we face from a hydrology standpoint when we think about managing floods. I just mentioned one of the first ones, that we're working with a relatively short observed record. We don't necessarily know that that's the end of the story, as they say. Clearly, as we looked at that record just on the last slide, that was, if you thought you knew everything there was to know about flows in the Sacramento River Basin in 1950, boy, were you wrong. Well, we're not sure that our knowledge is that much better in 2011, considering what we've seen in the past just few decades. Then there's this idea of non-stationarity. The climate scientists have been talking about this for a while, that with a change in climate, you can't expect that your runoff conditions that you've historically experienced will be the same. They might be, for example, much more highly variable, and this is a condition that our infrastructure is not designed to handle. And then even on a much more mundane level, if you look at these what are called FIRMs, or flood insurance rate maps, most people think of them more as the Fema Maps, as they call them. And if you're looking at buying a new house, maybe you've looked at the flood map where it shows where the 100-year floodplain is, and you want to think about if you're in the floodplain, you have to buy insurance, that kind of thing. Many of these maps were not based on very good topography, because the topography simply didn't exist, and FEMA put these together on the basis of what was available, and there's been a lot of human intervention in topography since some of the maps that FEMA has used came into being, in terms of people leveling land for agricultural purposes, rearranging things for urban construction, and a foot or two makes a big difference in these kind of maps. So that's a significant issue. And then we just have the usual problems about not having things like flood frequency curves being updated. And speaking of flood frequency, oh, sorry.
Good question. I live here in Long Beach, and I was required to buy flood insurance for a little while in the 80s or 90s, but now I'm not. Is that because they improved the maps? Or?
The rule is that, I'm going to put this as simply as I can. FEMA draws a map that says here's the 100-year flood area, and if you are living in an area which they deem to have less than 100-year protection, then you must buy insurance. Those maps are updated, and one of the things that triggers updates is, for example, if they improve levees or they improve some aspect of the infrastructure, that will get you out of, so to speak, that sub-100-year category. And actually, these days, that's often a point that local jurisdictions make to homeowners when they're going before them to seek a Prop 218 assessment to fund flood control work, is to say, look, now you're required to pay this high level on your flood insurance because you're living in what's considered a substandard flood zone. On the other hand, if we do these infrastructure improvements, your flood insurance rates will drop dramatically, and you will not be required to carry it. So one of the interesting things about working in flood hydrology is the concept of frequency analysis. And when we talk about the 100-year flood, the concept of a flood that occurs once in every 100 years, this has kind of evolved to be the standard of design practice for flood infrastructure. Well, there's the Bible, so to speak, that this is based on, is a document that was last formally published in 1982, and USGS is in the process of updating it now. They began in 2001. They're still working on it. They're not including climate change in this document, which is something that gives us some pause for consideration. But one of the things that we're finding is this idea of 100-year flood is not only very difficult to communicate to laypersons, but it also probably has some technical issues as well. So people in the hydrology and flood control world are struggling with this idea of how do we sort of shift the thinking from, if I'm living in the 100-year flood zone and I'm protected by a levee, I'm okay, to, well, gee, we really should be striving for a 200-year level of protection or something like that, and we should be relying less on levees and more on other complementary flood management techniques. And, oh, there we go. I just got ahead of myself there talking about the 100-year standard. And one of the things that's happened down here in Southern California, I mentioned the people were realizing that all that development out in the Inland Empire on those alluvial floodplain zones was, not an ideal situation. In 2004, the legislature passed a bill that created something called the Alluvial Fan Task Force, which brought together a number of state agencies, local agencies, and others to develop a proposed model ordinance that cities and counties with land use authority could use to try and develop more intelligently on these floodplains, if they're going on these alluvial fan floodplains. If they're going to build on them, let's see if we can do it in a way that would be make the most sense from a flood management standpoint. And incidentally, this has some other benefits as well, because it might preserve, for example, some of the best groundwater recharge areas, which tend to be right up at the apex of the fans. But you know, it's very difficult to, or it's difficult to get developers focused on this kind of an idea, because of course, if you have a large tract of land you want to develop it and maximize the potential economic value of that land. So this is actually a microcosm. Part of a challenge that we see throughout California is getting the flood control management agencies and local land use agencies on the same page, because often the land use approval, zoning, development process is, you know, handled differently than the flood aspects of it. So with climate change, well, they think things may get more extreme. And in fact, if you noticed day before yesterday in the paper, I believe, there was an AP article on some advanced leaks from the IPCC report that's going to come out at the end of this month about climate change and extreme events. And if you believe the advanced leak version, basically they sounded awfully pessimistic. So how do we deal with some of these climate change things? And this is just a little bit of a teaser for next week's lecture. One of the things on the flood side that holds a lot of promise is improving flood forecasting technologies. And that includes things such as developing new weather observing systems to deal with things like atmospheric rivers, so that we can have perhaps move to what we call forecast-based operation of reservoirs, which is talked about in our exhibit upstairs. So that's a pitch for the exhibit there. But this is one of the things that we can do that will buy us some time before we have to go in, perhaps, and do a major revamp of some of the Sierra Nevada water infrastructure. And climate predictions. You know, this is some of the things that we as water managers would like to know, because right now the science of understanding climate change and what it does to extreme events like floods is pretty much still in its infancy. So we have a lot of questions that we're asking the climate scientists, and we're trying to see what they can tell us about these things so that we can more intelligently plan for how to deal with them in the future. And this also includes some of the coastal inundation issues associated with sea level rise. And just last item here, for those of you who might want to learn a little bit more about flooding, here's some books you might want to think about reading. I would highly recommend the one on the Los Angeles River. It's written by a journalist. It's very readable, and obviously right in this part of the world. It does have a chapter or two on flooding in terms of historical development of the Los Angeles River. These other two are both considered classics in terms of California flooding, both of them by the same author. The one in the middle there for Battling the Inland Sea, that's a paperback version of a book that was originally published quite a bit earlier. I will warn you that particularly Gold versus Grain, which talks about the hydraulic mining controversy, it's a pretty dry read. It's very much, the latter two are scholarly sorts of books. Very interesting, but kind of hard to get through. But if you're really into the subject, I would say tackle Battling the Inland Sea first. So anyway, that's where I wrap up, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I want to thank Jerry and the Aquarium for having me here today. As always, the Weather Service, our office in Oxnard, we've been very good partners with the Aquarium. They always wanted to help out with what they do, and with Jerry opening the doors here for various events. He mentioned NOAA Day at the Aquarium. NOAA Day at the Aquarium, or NOAA on Your Planet. So who knows what it might be next year. But anyway, we've really valued the partnership with the Aquarium. We have other NOAA agencies here in Southern California. Fisheries Service is right downtown, and we work with them as well, and also working with Jeanine and the other water users around the state. I think we all know that we couldn't do what we do without partnerships. I think every agency out there could not act alone. So what I'd like to do is talk about the forecasting side of floods and flash floods. You heard Jeanine talk about the one difference between Central and Northern California and Southern California, one being floods versus flash floods. We really are very dry down here in Southern California. You know, we average about 15 inches of rain a year in Los Angeles, so this is a desert. We get all of our water imported from someplace else in the Sierras. And so when it rains down here, it usually rains very heavy, very hard, and we get flash flooding. And so as our mission of protection of life and property with the National Weather Service, we not only have to observe heavy precipitation, we have to then forecast that heavy precipitation. And luckily we've gotten better at doing that over the years, and I'll show you how much better we've gotten over the years. And we also have to work very close with our partners. I mean, I would say that as we're back in our office in Oxnard and we decide to issue a flash flood warning, we can't go around knocking door to door. We're not going to call everybody up and tell them there's going to be a flash flood there. We have to be able to work with local emergency response officials, fire departments, sheriff's departments. You know, evacuations have to take place for the protection of life and property, and so those partnerships are good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the communication side of our flood and flash flood warning programs. And if you have any questions along the way, just feel free to ask, or we can ask at the end. So again, flooding is a very serious problem. When you look at it from across the country, it is the most frequent severe weather event across the country. And 90% of all natural disasters involve flooding. When you think of the standard way of flooding, which may occur with heavy rain, of course we have commonly with hurricanes and tropical storms, we have very serious flooding. We all know what happened with Katrina. Of course, that was not only because of rain, but also because of storm surge and the breakdown of levee systems. But again, 90% of all natural disasters somehow involve flooding. So it is a very serious problem. We also, every state, every territory can experience flooding, all the way from Hawaii, Alaska, of course, California, as we go out east as well. The other thing to remember is nearly half of all flood fatalities occur in vehicles. And this, when flooded, turn around, don't drown. You'll see this sign various places in here. And I think if maybe one thing you can take away from here tonight is turn around, don't drown. And that's you know, we try to capture these weather safety slogans and sayings, and something that you can easily say in your sleep. And I probably do say that in my sleep because I see this all the time. But it works very well. Turn around, don't drown. And obviously, you see the power of moving water. And it doesn't take much water at all to lift up a car. 2 feet of water can carry a car away. With just 6 inches of water, you now have lost traction with the road surface. So you can see what's happened here in this bottom picture to that car. Okay. Also, very costly, extremely costly. On average, when you consider inflation, $7.6 billion a year in damages and losses. And also kill an average of 94 people per year. That is actually the most common severe weather-related cause of fatalities in the country. So actually, not related to flooding, opposite, heat is actually the leading killer, weather-related killer. And of course, this past year throughout Arizona and Texas, we had very severe heat conditions. This bottom picture is actually from the Nashville floods, the very serious Nashville floods. If you might remember in the news, there were fatalities in that flood. So one quick differentiation between flooding and flash flooding. I know Jeanine talked about this a little bit, but some things to keep in mind with flooding. Heavy rain over a long period of time, the ground becomes saturated. There's snow melt, which can contribute to it as well. Usually some body of water. You have this river system. Remember, you can have flooding with dam breaks as well. But again, that's one difference between the two. Can still be very costly, very damaging, and very deadly. Flash flooding, on the other hand, a very rapid rise of the water. Technically, we consider that to be within 6 hours and oftentimes within 3 hours of the heavy rainfall. Okay, and you also may have ice jams, which might contribute to that flash flooding. And life-threatening, definitely life-threatening. And oftentimes the power of it is underestimated. So how do we generate our rainfall forecast? We fortunately don't do it this way, even though sometimes I wonder if that might work the best. But we've really made quite a few strides in technology. By the way, when I first showed an interest in meteorology, I actually got a weather rock for a Christmas present. So it's never failed me. It's not white out here very often, at least now. But again, one of the challenges, it's sort of a gift at the same time it's a challenge, is all of integrating all the resources of rainfall observations. And we have quite a network, and I'll show you that in a minute. And it's really trying to integrate that fire hose of information, no pun intended, that we get. And of course the modeling, which has come a long ways over the years. So the forecast process. This is just one small piece of what you might see. We have numerical models. This is actually an output from our Hydrometeorological Prediction Center, HPC, which is in Camp Springs, Maryland, and they will produce a rainfall forecast that we can use in our forecast office's guidance. Of course, analysis is important. We look, especially here in California, satellites are a tremendous tool for really seeing what's going on over the ocean. We don't have very many observations at the surface over the ocean, so satellites are huge for forecasting the West Coast. So there's a forecast process. You look at what's going on. There's what's called a forecast funnel, where you look at things on a very large scale, almost a global scale, and then you come down to a very small scale. That's a common technique of forecast funneling. We also have ensembles, and this is kind of hard to see, but ensembles, what they do with model ensembles is they take one model and then they initialize that model with different initial conditions. So you just vary slightly those initial conditions. And you all heard of the butterfly effect and everything like that, and butterfly in Brazil, and then you get a tornado in California. But in reality, if you slightly change those initial conditions, you can get very big differences in the model outcomes. And so the whole idea is that if you take that ensemble and then you average those means on that ensemble, that's where you get your solution. So that's one piece of information. And not only do we have ensembles of one model, but we may have multiple models all with ensembles. We have our models within the National Weather Service, the European Center, ECMWF, UK Met Office, the Canadians, they all have their ensembles. We can then have multiple model ensembles where we take the blend of all models into one. So you can see that's, this depiction of this detective, it can sometimes be an overwhelming process. When you sit down and you really analyze and figure out what are we going to see 4 or 5 days from now. You also get some uncertainty over time, and that grows over time, that uncertainty, and you have to consider that. And so when Jeanine mentioned the idea of 10 days out, well, what we really need to do, and what we're really getting a better idea of now, is trying to express that uncertainty for the water users, for instance, and to know what is the worst scenario we can experience, and where can that also go wrong. So again, and then as you get that forecast out, you then update. You're constantly looking to keep that updated, okay? So atmospheric rivers, Jeanine mentioned this, and this is pretty amazing when you think about it. And I know that in my 6 years that I've been out here, we can't get a heavy rain event unless we have that moisture. To get heavy rain, you need two things. You need lift, you need some sort of lift, either a low pressure system or the air. Remember, we have the mountains that, rapid rise in elevation in Southern California. You look at the Santa Barbara South Coast, and the rise in elevation from the ocean is tremendous. And one of our wettest areas within our local area down here is actually in the Santa Ynez Range, San Marcos Pass. It's very wet because of that fact. But then you need the moisture. So in some cases you might be able to make up for the lack of either one of those components, but you can't have heavy rain unless you have moisture and lift. And what really separates the heavy rain events from the very heavy rain events is really how long that moisture is around. And when you think of the storms of 1861-62, what made that a tremendous event, at least not from the weather records, but from the reports, was how long that lasted. How many, and I forget the exact number, how many days that it rained, but a tremendously long period of rainfall, okay? And really, that's my own personal experience here too, is that we cannot get those real heavy rains unless we have something like this, an atmospheric river that lasts for several days. December, everybody remember last December? Obviously flooded Long Beach. That was a week of heavy rain. Not a whole lot of flooding in some areas because it was spread out over time, but again, we had one very long week of rain thanks to an atmospheric river. Our last rain that we just had in October, the beginning of October, that was actually almost very similar to what we're seeing here we had typhoons in the Western Pacific, moisture in the Western Pacific picked up in the jet stream and carried over to California. So we were seeing the formation of that atmospheric river by the end of September. And so we had a rough idea that by sometime during that week, give or take 2 or 3 days, we would see significant rain, or at least a change in our pattern. We couldn't have the details out that far, but we could be able to say something is going to happen sometime within those 3 days. So again, satellites are a tremendous tool for detecting these atmospheric rivers long in advance. Something, of course, they didn't have long ago, and you go back into the back 50, 60, 70 years ago. Okay. So then, of course, we have the arc storm, and AR is for atmospheric river. There's some debate over what the K is, whether that's the 1,000 storm, whether that's the 1,000-year storm, whether the K. It wouldn't sound very good if it was the R storm, maybe a pirate storm. So arc sounds better, and build the ark and everything. We're all about acronyms. That NOAA, stands for the National Organization for the Advancement of Acronyms. So we're working with the USGS on this project, and think of the Great Shakeout. I'm sure you've heard of California Great Shakeout. So the USGS, the Multi-Hazards Project, right here in Pasadena, Lucy Jones, you've probably seen her on TV a lot. So this is really her brainchild. We want to try to take that kind of idea, the Great Shakeout, which is intended to really increase that awareness of earthquakes and get you ready for that earthquake. More people are afraid of earthquakes than arc storms. I think when you really think about it, we've sustained ourselves through heavy rains, 2005, 97, 83, we're okay. And we can predict them. So you'll hear on the news if, it's going to be raining next week. It won't be an arc storm, but we'll get some rain. Okay. Well, earthquake, that's something, we can't predict it. We don't know what's going to happen. Could have happened 5 minutes from now, 10 minutes from now, we don't know. And that adds a little bit to the fear. And in a way, it adds a little bit to the respect of earthquakes, whereas atmospheric rivers. So arc storm really tries to build up that awareness that this is important. And what arc storm does is it takes, we know what happened in 1861-62. We don't have the meteorology from 1861-62. And what we try to do is we combine the meteorology then from 2 storms that Jeanine mentioned in 1969 and 1986, and try to create that period of rainfall. The challenge is then we model that, we feed that data into models, produce this arc storm event. The challenge is to bringing that all the way down to the surface to see what the runoff response is. And we're just now starting to do that process with Ventura County Watershed Protection District is actually trying to do that right now. Take the actual output from the arc storm and see what happens with our system. Now, of course, our flood protection today is much different than it was in 1861-62. But again, another part of it, which Gary mentioned, the Art Design Center, is really designing those awareness campaigns that people can understand this is what flooding can do, this is how we can be prepared. So it really is quite a project, and it's still working ongoing. One thing, kind of a takeaway here, if we look at the volume of water vapor within an atmospheric river, they have determined that there is as much water in that atmospheric river, 7.5 to 15 times the average water that moves through the mouth of the Mississippi. So if you had a way to measure that water through a screen in the Mississippi, atmospheric rivers actually have 7.5 to 15 times more water. So that is a lot of water. Okay. So one of the pieces in the Weather Service that we have is, of course, monitoring river levels, forecasting river levels. And we have river forecast centers, which California Nevada River Forecast Center is in Sacramento. And we actually have 13 river forecast centers across the country. Hydrologic modeling, of course, and they do provide precipitation forecasts. They give us flash flood guidance, and what that means is that when you look at the basins, just imagine looking at a hillside and you see all the variations in the basin. Water falls in a basin, gravity pulls it down. Basins have different characteristics. Some are it's more solid rock, some of the water might filter through a little bit. Some might have a lot of vegetation, some basins. The Weather Service has a weather spotter program, a storm spotter program. If you're interested in it, come see me afterwards. And it's a really neat program where you help us out a lot by, you give us a phone number where we can call you. You get a rain gauge like this, if you maybe have some other weather equipment. But you tell us where you live, so we put your mark on a map. We give you a phone number that you can call us, and you can say, it's an 800 number, you call us up and say, it's raining like crazy, my rain gauge has 3 inches in it in the last hour. And that's good information, and we write that down. Or we look at our radar, we see a storm that's nearby your location, we call you up, and say, hey Joe, we show some heavy rain, what have you see any hail, do you have any wind? And so it's a really neat program. We have just over 1,000 storm spotters in our area, and they move on and move around. One time we called a storm spotter and asked them what they were seeing out their back door, and they were in Colorado. So they had moved to Colorado. So that was a good way to update our storm spotter database. We said, well, what do you see out in Colorado? And he was kind of mad at himself because he wasn't back here to see the storm. But that's the way it goes. Okay, so again, it's a very complex network that we always have to ingest, and we can use different pieces here to help correct other pieces. Rain gauge, unless a rain gauge is sitting underneath a roof and not a lot of water is running into your rain gauge, that is the best ground truth. And then we can look at the radar estimated precipitation, and if there's a difference there, then we can apply that bias as we through that day and say, well, the radar may be overestimating what we're getting for precipitation or underestimating. You can't beat the ground truth. We also rely on some of the local networks, the counties. We're very lucky out here, at least within Ventura County and Los Angeles County especially. We have Ventura County Watershed Protection District. This is actually a map, a Google map off of their webpage. In Los Angeles also has a very similar looking map. And you can look at rainfall amounts from surface reporting sites from 1 hour, 3 hours, 6, and all the way out. This is actually the only way I could get anything on this map. It hasn't rained in the last 28 days. So this goes back 28 days. But again, you get the idea of the kind of density that we have in our rainfall network. Other tools that we use within the office, we have a system that's called a Flash Flood Monitoring and Prediction System, FFMP. And what that does is that these are all different basins. And this is an actual event from last December. These are all different basins. And what it does is that rather than the country, and it's a very easy, you click on it, you then see, I'm going to show you here a map or a chart. This is the kind of thing that you'll see. So again, the River Forecast Center takes this is the observed line right here. And then this is a forecast line. Okay, so as they forecast their expected precipitation into the river forecast model, then it comes out with that projected amount. And then those red dashes, the orange dash is the monitor stage for flooding. The red dash is actual flood stage. Okay, and this was from 2005, as a matter of fact. And so again, just one of the other tools that we can use to really look at our river levels. The only time that I've been here, to give you an idea of how dry Southern California really is, I've yet to see a 2005 storm, right, Jeanine? And the only time we really had any one of these graphs that showed anything of seriousness was March 20th of this past year. It was a Sunday. We had, I know in Ventura County, it just rained like crazy. We had south winds, trees blew down, but we actually, the San Ynez River at the Narrows was actually, I believe, up to flood stage. And that was because we had so much rain, and it was about a 12-hour period. And so it gives you an idea that there's a reason why all of our, we mostly have dry washes around here and there's no water in our rivers. And then also, this is Folsom Dam, as a matter of fact, but the information that is provided by river forecast centers, that direct communication, can be used to help control the levels of reservoirs. Lake Piru in Ventura County right now, usually I believe has about 40,000 acre feet of water. That's down half now because they've already lowered that water in preparation for winter rains, okay? And they can also make releases even in a shorter period of time if we're expecting heavy rain. Just kind of, I'm going to skip through this real fast, but you know, we're looking at how, you know, we have to bring the observations in. We have a model that estimates what's happening with that. It goes through this. This is rainfall rate, accumulation up on the side. Across the bottom is time. And so what you see, all these little dots, the USGS has gone through and said, these are all certain debris flows. And as we get into higher rates over a shorter period of time is where we get the higher susceptibility to debris flows. And over about the 5-year span of the project, that's what's really come out. It's when it just rains like crazy over that short period of time, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, more so than these longer duration. So, hit it. So this is a debris flow that occurred down in Devore back in December 25th, 2003. And what happened here was this gentleman actually, he got this video camera for Christmas. And this is what happened in front of his house. So this was actually, he got to, good thing he had a camera, but this was out of a recent burn area. And around this similar event, there was actually a Mormon camp in which I believe 12 people were killed in a camp. But you can see the size of these boulders that it's moving, and you know, the black color of the water. A lot of times debris flows are even thicker than this, but you can see there's nothing, you know, the size, what it takes to take something the size of that boulder to move it down the road, such as this. So again, a very dangerous and damaging phenomenon.
It's a road there?
That's a street right there, that's correct. And there's a burn area up above that, a very recent burn area, as a matter of fact. So we actually had on February 6, 2010, I'm just going to go through this real quick. We had a very damaging debris flow below La Crescenta and the La Cañada Flint Ridge. We had a process for alerting the users that we might get some heavy rain. We have weather stories. If you've ever seen our weather story, these are kind of the things that you can print them off, put them on your refrigerator, mag them on your refrigerator, and you got a way now to one place that they can take home and share with others. This is how many times in severe weather, it's the people that have to take action themselves, but they have to know what it can do. We directly communicate with emergency officials on the phone with LA County Fire, Long Beach Fire, anybody. We also have flood emergency wording that we are going to put in our flash flood warning starting this year. And those are very rare situations, but the whole idea is to really try to get people's attention to say, this is an extremely serious situation. And then societal responses. Within the last several years, the Weather Service has really invested a lot of time into trying to understand how do people respond to warnings. You look at the Joplin tornado that we just had just recently, and when they went back and did an assessment, and one of the things they did is they asked people, what did you do when you heard the tornado warning? Well, first of all, there's the idea that they've heard sirens in Joplin before and nothing's happened. So there's that false alarm issue. Well, and then there was one response that said, and so the warning sirens go for 30 seconds and then they stop. I mean, a tornado warning might go for 45 minutes. Well, you can't blare a siren for 45 minutes. So there was some responses that said, well, when the sirens went off, after 30 seconds, we thought it was over. The threat was gone, okay? There were others that did not take action until they actually saw things happen. Whether they saw the tornado, or if they called a relative and talked to a relative and sort of like, let's do, groupthink. I think we should do something. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do to really try to make sure that everybody can survive a storm like this. Yes?
How have you incorporated like social media or text alerts and things like that to other people?
Well, actually, I don't know if you have any Facebook friends in here, but We're working on it. I think we're up to like 800 or something, but go visit us on Facebook. We have Facebook, that we don't communicate our warnings through Facebook. Facebook is more of a conduit for weather safety education and awareness. Twitter, there is a way to actually get information out on Twitter, and it's not common throughout all the offices. As a government agency, unfortunately, we just can't go step out and just do something on a whim. Anybody know about government agencies and the way we operate? Unlike private industry. But it usually takes an act of Congress. But we are moving forward pretty fast along those lines. One important thing too is, and I'll have a slide here, is technology has allowed us, for instance, to do what are called go-to meetings and go-to webinars. We'll have a list of over 50 emergency responders, county, city, state users, that we can talk to them directly and they can ask questions about what's coming up with a certain storm. And then, of course, the media is very important in getting that word out. But I think with social media, it's very interesting because social media, which is a way to really communicate to a very important age group. And when you look at, let's take like when we had our heat event, our record heat last year, September of last year, downtown Los Angeles reached 113 degrees before the sensor broke. And the reason it broke is because this is down at on the USC campus, an official site. It's so packed with components that it just overheated. It got very hot, if you remember last September, in places like Long Beach. And a lot of times when you look at places like Long Beach, Manhattan Beach, we don't have air conditioning because it doesn't get that hot very often. It doesn't make sense to have AC. And so we have to have a way of really trying to communicate. We're going to have a very severe heat event and reaching the people in Long Beach. Well, if we can get that information out, say, to somebody who lives in Pasadena, who maybe their mom lives in Manhattan Beach. Mom, did you hear that it's going to get really hot tomorrow? I mean, this is, we have to try to rely and know that there's going to be, once we tell one person, they will tell other people. Because we find that, like I said, the Joplin tornado, all these situations, you're calling relatives. What are you going to do? Call a neighbor. Yes?
I think not just social media, the newer technologies now are becoming more and more location aware. Your cell phone, your internet browser, Apple, Google have a real big focus for advertising dollars on trying to find out where you are in order to refer you to people that are very close to you. And I know that Google, as a company initiative, is tasking their employees to spend 20% of their time doing things that give back to the community or better the environment or things of that nature. We can't be too far away from having the ability somehow to set a geographic emergency area and through Verizon or the other telephone carriers have a severe emergency warning be able to go out to people's cell phones that are in a specific area. Is there a group working on that?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we're working with a company out of Norman, Oklahoma on a different type of project. This is a project that will allow TV stations to talk to us from our office live without having to send a reporter up there. But it's a company called Weather Decision Technologies out of Norman, Oklahoma. And they have an application, well, they have several applications. One is an application where on your phone it knows where you are when you enter an area that's under a warning, severe thunderstorm warning, tornado warning. It actually gives you a voice alert that tells you you are in an area that is under this warning. So it's doing exactly that. The challenge that the Weather Service really faces is that does the Weather Service want to be in that type? There's so much in the way of technology out there in companies that have far more expertise than we do in developing these kind of applications. And so there are certain, like on my BlackBerry, I have a program called Interactive NWS, but how long that might last, I don't know. And all that does is say, you define your area, and when there's a warning in that area, it sends you a text message. But the more sophisticated applications that are out there on, I don't have an iPhone, I'm sorry, but there are applications that do exactly that. And I think it's all about the partnering with these tech companies and with the Weather Service and NOAA to do exactly what you're doing. You're right. And even on OnStar and things like that, and being able to, you're on your car and you're able to know I'm driving into an area that's under a tornado warning. You know, the other issue that we have with warning is when you look at it, right now, we define the science right now in partnership with the local agencies. So public response to warnings. You know, people have to know that what these things can do. They have to understand what the threat is, and then accept. Okay, this is a dangerous situation. There was a tornado that went, a major tornado that went 4 blocks from my house in 1975 in Omaha, Nebraska, and we were actually in our basement 20 minutes before that tornado even hit. As soon as the tornado warning hit, my mom said, "Let's go down." Now, I'd never been hit by a tornado before, but growing up in the Midwest, I knew what tornadoes could do, okay? And then you have to get that behavior change. You have to know, this is, either I know somebody where this happened to them, and that was one of the problems in locking down a Flint Ridge on February 6th. I've never seen a debris flow here. How can these things happen? And so then, again, so it's an ongoing challenge on our part. So again, remembering something like that could help you maybe save this. This was in Arizona, actually. And again, half of the fatalities in flash flooding is within vehicles. So why don't people turn around? It seems pretty obvious to me, right? And there was actually a PhD student at the University of Arizona that had a study where she surveyed 170 residents in Tucson and asked them, why don't you turn around? And it was interesting, the responses. So they trusted a sign. Say there was a sign that says, you know, when flooded, turn around, don't drown. Okay, I believe that sign. So why didn't they turn around? Well, this was kind of interesting too. They crossed it. They thought it was getting worse. So it's almost like, I better hurry up and get across this road, or I'm going to be in trouble. Okay. They couldn't find another route, so you know they might have pulled out their Google Maps and like, I can't get to my dentist appointment unless I take this road right over here, okay? So by golly, I'm not going to miss my dentist appointment. I've had that for 2 months. So they saw their vehicles cross successfully. And we all know in flash flooding, you get these water rises that can change very quickly within minutes. So just because you see one car go across doesn't mean that now 5 minutes later, the water level is going to be the same. So they called a friend, cracks me up. So they called a friend or a relative, and I don't know if they asked them, so I'm over here on Elm Street. I've got, what do you think? What do you think I should do? Should I go out? Should I drive across? And, you know, they're probably doing something else. They're on the internet. They're not even paying attention to their question anyway. So that was amazing. So one of the responses that she got was people saying, well, why do we keep on building roads and low water crossings? You know, let's try to just avoid the hazard altogether. So again, very interesting. So as we look out and some of the technology, you know, as I showed you, we're up to almost 70 minutes on a flash flood warning lead time, but there's still quite a bit more we can do. One of the things we're going to do is Doppler Radar. With Doppler Radar, you know, like light waves, we go out with one waveform like this. With what's called a dual pole or dual polarization radar, what happens is you send 2 waves out in a cross. So you send waves that go like this, you send waves that go like this. And all the radar can do is send out a burst of energy, listen to hear how much energy comes back. If you get a very solid object, such as a hailstone, that's going to send, some of the energy might refract off, and you're going to then listen for what energy reflects back. Hailstone's going to give you a lot of power back. A flat raindrop may give you the perception. And what we know is that as raindrops get larger, they get flatter, okay? And so that, if you have a waveform that's just going this way, it may give you a false idea of how much water is in that cloud, okay? So right now we're in the process of deploying, actually it's modification of the existing radar. So I'm not quite sure when the Santa Ana radar will be modified, but the Ojai radar will be upgraded in April, Vandenberg in February, I believe. So what happens is you get something like this. And this is just an example on the right here, 2 different radar estimated precipitation graphics. The bottom one is with the existing radar. The top one is with dual pole. So that dual pole is able to better tell the kind of hydrometeors that are in that cloud. And of course, we have a lot of rain gauges, but we don't have them everywhere. This is like, if we could get accurate rainfall estimations from radar, that's like having a rain gauge every 2 miles, okay? And so, again, this is going to be a massive, I think a massive improvement in our ability to estimate rainfall by radar, okay? The other thing is what's called CHIPS. This is an easy one to remember, especially in California, but Community Hydrologic Prediction System. I mentioned ensembles earlier. So if you take multiple hydrologic models and all combine those into one model, then we've got the CHIPS, and that should be, the CNRFC actually started theirs already, and then the other RFCs in 2012. We also have what's called a high resolution rapid refresh model, and it's much easier to say that than HRRR numerical model. But what the neat thing about this is that now what we're doing is not just forecasting, here's what the sea level pressure will be, here's what the winds will be like 12 hours from now. It's actually modeling and telling us here's what the radar reflectivities will look like 12 hours from now. Okay, so it really is, we're actually using it now here in Oxnard. It really gives you some, and each time rapid refresh means it runs again every hour. So every hour it ingests that information, runs again. And so really the best thing about this is this reflectivity forecast that it produces. Next generation radar is what's called phased array radar. And actually the military has been using phased array radar for many years now, many years. And what phased array is, right now our conventional radar is a dish, and the thing is just cranking away. And it spins around, the elevation goes up, spins around again. Well, you can see that that's very time consuming. We can only sample the atmosphere in one volume, one time about every 6 minutes or so. Phased array radar is just, it's everywhere. You can concentrate on a certain area, and it samples that same volume in a sixth of the amount of time that we sample it today. So a tremendous amount of information and data. The other thing you may have all have seen and heard about the launch in Vandenberg last Friday, and that was actually a very important launch because that was the MPOS, whatever, you get it, MPP, preparatory, I got it. Project, MPP, spacecraft, and it is a polar orbiting satellite, which is a joint NOAA-NASA project. And what it is, it's really, we'll start using the MPP, climate and weather monitoring or forecast. It's got very brand new, state-of-the-art, highly scientifically advanced remote sensing instruments, which are actually better than the current satellites we have up there now. And what it is, it's a risk reduction effort to help fill the gap between our current satellites and what's planned here in a little bit. And you see it has a 7-year lifespan, about a 5-year mission life. And those are pretty conservative too. We end up getting a little more out of the satellites than we do, but they do have a certain lifespan. Yes?
What's the difference between lifespan and mission life?
Well, you've got instruments on the satellite, and you have the cost to operate and maintain those instruments. And so I think when you look at the lifespan, that's the actual lifespan when everything dies on the satellite. But then you've got a certain mission which says, we want to try to accomplish this over this amount of time. So it's actually a good thing that they set their mission life less than the lifespan of the satellite. But again, this is a kind of a bridge to a much bigger project, which is the JPSS, the Joint Polar Satellite System. And what this is that for many years now, we've been actually in a partnership with DoD, NASA, and NOAA. Well, DoD has kind of said, we need to operate our own satellites. And so the JPSS is actually a NOAA-NASA project. And the timeline here is for the first JPSS launch to be in 2016. So again, the MPP hopefully will be up there now to bridge that gap with new algorithms, new sensors on that satellite. And then 2018, we have the second launch of JPSS. But again, the whole idea is to, the instrumentation that's on these satellites, and much of which is developed right here at JPL, gives us better resolution, more accurate estimation of water vapor, not only visible channels, but infrared channels, microwave channels, and also these satellites also help us better understand climate change. And the reason you need these polar orbiting satellites, as I said, is that to really understand what's happening across the globe, you need to sample across the globe, geostationary, stay on one spot. Okay?
So when you say increased resolution, what are you talking about there?
Well, increased resolution in terms of
Pixels.
Yeah, pixels, essentially pixels.
But I mean, MODIS like 250 meters and CWIPS was like a kilometer, so are we getting better?
I think we're getting better than that, correct. So, that's all I had. We do have some flooding down in Southern California once in a while. This is 2005 up in Ventura County, and some people that didn't turn around and drown, and hopefully didn't drown. That's my contact information and our webpage, and then I can't leave here without saying try to find us on Facebook.
Mike, thank you.
Okay, thank you.